This episode of The Climate Show is brought to you by hot-topic.co.nz, cyblogs.co.nz, skepticalscience.com, scoop.co.nz and idealog.co.nz.
Even if the best case scenarios happen, the consequences are still serious and we still need to act.
What good is a drop in the ocean? What good is a drop in the ocean?
Hello and welcome to The Climate Show. This is episode number 35, recording this day, September the 10th, 2013. The Climate Show is all about climate science, policy, politics and the solutions. My name is Glenn Williams here in London. My two co-hosts with me, Gareth Ronalden there in Waipara, North Canterbury. Hi Gareth.
Good evening, Glenn. Or good morning.
Good day or good evening to John Cook joining us in Brisbane.
Yeah, we just say g'day, whatever time of the day is here.
That's true. That's very, very true. It's been another few months since the last episode. Apologies for that, but we've just had a cracker summer here in the UK, so I've just been spending most of my time getting out there while it lasts, because it certainly has lasted a decent amount of time, but finished yesterday or the day before, I've got to say. Suddenly it's very, very cold here, and it's so abrupt. I don't remember summers ending so abruptly in New Zealand, but that seems to be the way that it goes here. But I know, Gareth, you've been experiencing a very mild winter.
The meteorological winter, which in the southern hemisphere, of course, John won't know this because he lives in Queensland and they don't have winter there at all, but June, July and August are the meteorological equivalents in the southern hemisphere of December, January and February. And the numbers for New Zealand's winter showed that it was the hottest winter in 150 years, so since records began. And that's, visible all the way around the country with flowers early, and I've got asparagus in the garden a full month ahead of when we should have them. And as people watching the news in New Zealand today will know, we've got the spring weather, which is big northwest winds howling down over the South Island and blowing lorries over and sparking fires. So if I disappear early tonight, it'll be because the roof's gone flying. Well, we had a record-breaking drought in the summer, which covered a larger area of New Zealand than any previous drought. So, it's been a year of extremes, but it's also been pretty extreme in Australia, hasn't it, John?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Bureau of Meteorology just released a report in 2012. Well, we just had the hottest 12 months on record. We've had, I think the month we just had, August, was the hottest August on record, and we've had the hottest season on record. So, yeah, we've been breaking a lot of records. And summer, like our summer was just off the scales hot. The angry summer, they called it. So, yeah, I'll see you your hottest winter, Gareth, and raise you the hottest 12 months.
Yeah, well, watching the news today, I saw that Sydney's already had two 30 degrees days so far this month. The record, I think, is 4 in the month, and they've had 2 already. And some reasonably serious bushfires starting in the Sydney region already.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing to think of it happening this early in the year. And spring, I think it started at least a couple of weeks, possibly a month early in Australia as well, similar to New Zealand. So we seem to be, whatever weather patterns are affecting us, it seems to be happening over this region. Although New Zealand, I always think of New Zealand as just around the corner of Australia, but you're actually quite a distance from us.
Yeah, the distance that put it into perspective for me when I moved from London to Waipara was that the distance from Christchurch to Sydney is more or less exactly the same as the distance from London to Moscow.
Mm. I seem to be channeling Sarah Palin whenever I think of New Zealand. It's like I can see Auckland from my house or something.
Does that mean you think that you can buy New Zealand? I don't know. Just on screen there at the moment, we've got some of these the pictures today from the South Island of New Zealand there, where you've got a truck that's overturned on the Dunedin Northern Motorway there. fences being blown down in Ashburton. You've got tiles being ripped up there in Timaru. So this is all just down the road from where you are, Gareth. Also, of course, well, it wouldn't be windy in Canterbury without being extremely windy and gusty in Wellington. You've got some lampposts being blown over there. Gosh, it's all sort of happening. But I mean, that's to be expected. It is springtime, so you'll get these wild winds.
Yeah, well, the wild wind of record for the Canterbury region is the Great Gale of 1975, which had wind speeds of 170 kilometres per hour, and a major pine plantation called the Balmoral Forest, somewhere north of me. For those who know this part of New Zealand, it's on the banks of the Huranui River on the way to Hamner Springs. Half of the forest was blown down in that gale, so I'm hoping we're not going to get a repeat of that.
Well, so this is an all-news special, seeing it has been a large gap since the last episode. We'll just run through a whole lot of news that perhaps you may have missed. So this is a really good opportunity, a good show just to catch up on the latest climate news. And first up, we are actually going to Australia with the events there on the weekend. John Cook, I know you've been...
Is that an attempt at an Australian accent thing?
I wouldn't dare. But John, I know you've been celebrating. You've hardly had any sleep, of course. You've been at the various parties around town for the results over the weekend. You'd be pretty happy with the result there of the Australian election?
Yeah, that's decidedly not the case, I'm afraid.
I can see that on your face.
It was a... Yeah, I mean, there's been a sort of an air of resignation among many of us for leading up to this election, because it had an air of inevitability about it. But the election was really, we were staring down the barrel of a prime minister who thinks that climate change is crap, who thinks that carbon dioxide shouldn't be worried about because it's invisible, and has declared a blood oath to repeal the carbon tax as soon as he got into office. And so that's what we've got.
Well, they are quite definitely setting about getting rid of the carbon tax, aren't they? I know that they've been certainly on the news in New Zealand talking about drawing up the legislation to repeal the carbon tax. But I gather that in order to do that, they have to not only get it through the main parliament, it also has to go through the Senate, and that's not so straightforward, is it, John?
Well, the Senate in Australia is nothing like straightforward at the moment. In fact, it's a bit of a zoo. Australia has two things that I quite liked was compulsory voting and preferences. But put those two things together and get lots of our parties dealing preferences in strange ways, and you can get some bizarre results. And one of the results is that very minor parties would only get a fraction of the vote, less than 1%, but because of the way the preferences were dealt out, they've actually got Senate positions. So now we have a minor party, the Motorist Enthusiast Party, the Australian Motorist Enthusiast Party, who've got a Senate seat. We've got what's the other one? The Sporting, I forget. It's some.
Wasn't there one that had a similar party name to the Liberals, and people thought they might have been voting for the Liberal Party, where in fact they were voting for that independent?
I think that was the Democratic Liberal Party, perhaps. But, and then there's a Sporting Party. So there's a party they just care about their cars, and now they're deciding the carbon legislation of Australia, which then has ripples throughout the world. So it's a bit of a surreal and crazy situation when you think about it. And like as Gareth said, like our hope was that it would be difficult for Abbott to repeal the carbon tax, because if he didn't have control of the Senate, it would be impossible for him to put his legislation through. But the situation now is the balance of power is really held by these minor parties, and so the Motorist Enthusiast Party might be willing to throw the carbon tax under the bus if they get some legislation that allows them to hoon around in their cars with more freedom. I don't really know what their policy is, but it's
Whatever that means.
it's a very
Point of order, Glenn and John. Wouldn't the Australian Motorist Enthusiast Party throw anything under a bus?
yeah. So it's just a little bit chaotic and surreal at the moment, and I guess there are actually 8 minor parties who got Senate seats, but the Liberals only need 6 of them to vote for repealing the carbon tax, and so we're just going to have to wait and see what happens.
But there is a really quite substantial irony in that Abbott and his party are taking this position at a time when Australia's just had its hottest 12 months on record, and when the whole nation has been experiencing these remarkable extremes. I don't want to wish an extreme summer on Australia again, but how can the LNP actually continue in the face of these extremes?
Well, I mean, the power of political ideology can overcome almost any evidence, no matter how overwhelming it is, and it's really ideology that's driving both climate policy and even how they view the science. And it was during the election campaign. There's a funny thing where in Australia it's politically incorrect to deny science, which is the opposite of what it's like in America, where it's politically incorrect for Republicans to accept climate science. But in Australia, Tony Abbott has at least paid lip service to climate science. But every now and then these Freudian slips come through. And the recent quote was talking about CO2 being an invisible substance. And I forget the exact quote, but talking about an invisible substance. I can't even remember it, to tell you the truth. But it was a statement that he'd said several times. It keeps coming out. And the irony is that it's the fact that carbon dioxide is invisible, that it lets sunlight through, which is a big part of why we have the greenhouse effect. It lets sunlight through, but it blocks infrared heat going out.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, Abbott himself he's a smart guy. I mean, he was a Rhodes Scholar, so he's got a decent brain. I mean, as you say, perhaps motivated reasoning and ideology trumps even someone who's got a really first-class brain.
I mean, Dan Cahan just released research over the last week that a lot of us have been discussing with much interest, and what he found was that the higher someone's, the higher their education level or the higher their scientific literacy, it doesn't mean that they necessarily accept climate change more. It really depends on their political ideology. So, because this was an American study, Democrats who are more educated, who are more literate, are more accepting of climate change, but conservatives who are more scientifically literate are more denying of climate change. And so what this research really says is that the more educated a conservative is, the more tools and skills they have to equip themselves with whatever arguments they need to deny the science.
If anyone's taught us that, of course, it's our friend Moncton. I mean, he's a smart guy, and we know what he's all about. So there's a good example there.
Absolutely, and I suppose the next item that we're going to talk about this evening or this morning or today is also an example of how people who ostensibly are functioning, high-functioning people can completely misread the evidence and misrepresent it quite deliberately. And that's the news items that have been popping up in the British right-wing media over the last 3 or 4 days, claiming that because the Arctic sea ice hasn't melted as much this year as it did last year, that somehow there's a big recovery on the way, and that global cooling is about to start. And this particular reporter, who's a chap called David Rose, certainly have been involved in some of the more outrageous kind of distortions of reality when it comes to climate. And of course, once the Mail had got it, the Telegraph, which is the right-wing broadsheet newspaper, jumped all over it in a story that looked remarkably like it was. Well, it was all mistaken word for word for the Mail, I have to say. And then the Daily Express jumped on the bandwagon. Connoisseurs of the British press, everyone will know that the Express and the Mail are great rivals. And the Daily Express managed to not only get the story wrong, but to imply that there were secret memos being thrown around inside the IPCC, facing up to this reality of global cooling. And now we see, I saw this morning, in fact, that the story had spread to MSN, and no doubt the usual climate suspects will be running very, very hard with this new global cooling myth that they're going for, based around the ice. And fortunately, John's colleague at Skeptical Science, the cyborg Dana Nucitelli, produced a wonderful kind of takedown to the Daily Mail article at The Guardian, which I think went out on the 9th, so just a day or so ago, featuring the wonderful graph. It's not an escalator, is it? It's a descalator. What you call an escalator that goes down?
Well, I think you can go to the new word. I think we're going to go with that, the descalator.
Have you got that on screen, Glenn? Can you pop that up? Because it is a remarkable little animation.
Yeah. So what's that showing?
Well, this is how the skeptics view the decline of the sea ice. Every time there's a sort of upward bump, those red lines in the animation, they declare a recovery. But when you look at the big picture, and you look at all the data, and you look at what's happening, you see that we're seeing a very steady and steepening decline.
Okay, so in the Daily Mail, they've got the satellite kind of pictures of the Arctic in August 2012 and August 2013. August 2013, it looks like there is a larger ice sheet. So what's, how does the data that's been presented in that graph relate to what we're seeing between 2012 and 2013?
Okay, well, the maps that you can see on that Daily Mail story are actually maps of ice extent, and they just show the areas where there's more than, it's not clear which particular data set they were using, but it would be either more than 15% or more than 30% ice. And one of the interesting things about this year, it's undoubtedly true, there is more sea ice in the Arctic at the moment than there was at the same time last year. And it looks as though this year's minimum is not going to set a new record. In fact, it looks as though it'll end up somewhere around about 2009, 2010 levels, which were, at the time, a little bit of a recovery from 2007, but still very much on that descending trend. The character of the ice this year, though, has been very interesting. It's been very, very broken up. There's been a large area of open water very close to the North Pole itself. And so although the extent, if you look at the sort of the amount of the ocean that's being covered by ice, it is much bigger this year. The nature of the ice is much less compact. Right. And it's been not if you want to look at it as, in terms of good and bad, it's not been a good year for melting ice. What will happen next year remains to be seen, but the ice that's there is very different to the ice that was there 10 years ago.
So it's basically thinner, because I guess one thing that we've talked about on the show before is that what also matters more greatly is probably than the extent is as you say, the nature of the ice, and if it's thinner, then it will take a shorter amount of time in the future to disappear. Is that right?
Yeah, in theory.
There's a couple of points. Basically, what David Rhodes is doing is a magic trick. Like, we have several decades worth of data, and he's trying to convince people that the Arctic is fine based on 2 data points, just on last year and this year. So he's ignoring the whole several decades of data, which obviously is not giving you the full picture. But then, as you say, Glenn, the sea ice extent is just what's happening on the surface. But what's really important is what's happening beneath the surface, and looking at the full volume of ice. and that has been getting thinner and thinner over the last few decades as well. And so even while Arctic, the extent, what's happening at the top, jumps up and down from year to year, the volume has just been much more steadily going down and down from year to year. And so 2012 was definitely the record low. I imagine the volume in 2013 would be quite similar, because it doesn't show that variability jumping up and down from year to year in the same way that extent does.
No, just to say, John's absolutely right that the volume trend gives us a better look at the big picture. 2013 will certainly show a greater volume at the end of the melt season than last year, but there is, I mean, the key point, and this is what I think John's getting at when he says that David Rose is ignoring, or the Daily Mail is ignoring the big picture and picking on just two items. The big picture is that the ice up there is very greatly reduced on 10 years or 20 years ago, and that this is already enough to be having discernible impacts on, well, first of all, people getting ships through the Arctic. I believe a Chinese ship is on its way through at the moment over the north of Russia. But it's already beginning to be having an effect on the way that the weather patterns are flowing around the northern hemisphere. But I think just to sort of I know this is a bit of anecdata, if you like, but the thing that struck me about this summer in the northern hemisphere and the winter that we've had down here in New Zealand and to a certain extent in Australia is that it's almost a mirror image of what we had last year. Last year, certainly in New Zealand, we had a setup which was bringing us really quite severe cold spells. We didn't have a record cold winter, but we had a number of cold spells that certainly felt really like winter, and they were relatively prolonged too. So that was one thing. And at that time, the northern hemisphere was having a summer that was very conducive to melting ice, or more conducive to melting ice than the northern hemisphere in the Arctic. This year's kind of the reverse. We've got the hot weather down here, and they've had the cooler weather up north. Britain has had a hotter, drier summer, didn't have the wet summer that they had last year. So it looks to me like things have flipped kind of to the opposite of what they were last year, which is not a very scientific way of discussing atmospheric science, but there we are.
Well, do you think? I mean, just putting it out there, that there is the extent of the ice, not the quality of the ice, but the extent of the ice, perhaps has some effect on the northern hemisphere summers and winters as well.
I think what's emerging from the data is that the general warming in the Arctic has reduced the amount of ice, and that ice refreezes in the autumn and early winter. And when it refreezes, it releases a lot of heat into the atmosphere, and that is imposing a certain pattern on the way the northern hemisphere weather is flowing around the northern hemisphere, as it were. I should be waving my hands here, really, to sort of illustrate. But the other thing is that the generalized warming in the north has reduced the temperature differential between the pole and the tropics, and so it's that temperature differential, if you like, that drives the velocity of the weather around the northern hemisphere. And with a warmer Arctic, you don't get so much energy going into the kind of jet stream, and so the weather moves more slowly. And that's been visible, I think, in the northern hemisphere this year. The weather's tended to get stuck for periods. So Britain was lucky and got stuck in a relatively hot August. A couple of months prior to that, we discussed it in one of possibly the last show or the one before. The weather in Europe was stuck in wet, and Germany and Eastern Europe had those massive floods. So I think there is certainly some signs that that's discernible in the weather we're having this year.
And let's move on to the next story. The 12th session of Working Group 1 will take place from the 23rd to the 26th of September in Stockholm, Sweden. What has this working group been working on, and what will they be talking about?
Over to you, John.
Okay, well, I mean, this is possibly one of the most leaked documents in history, and I think just about every media outlet has reported on the leaked documents. So the working group 1 is explains the physical science of climate change, and then working group 2 talks about the impacts, and working group 3 is talking more about the policies and solutions. So now we're just talking about the basic science of climate change, what we're measuring, what's been happening, what's being observed, and really detection and attribution, so explaining what's causing it. And so it's really those attribution statements that people are quite interested in. So in the AR4, in the fourth assessment report in 2007, the IPCC said that it was, there was a more than a 90% chance that humans were causing at least half of global warming over the last 50 years. No, it's actually greenhouse gases, but I'm just being technical there. Now, in the new report, if the leaked versions are accurate, and I don't imagine they would have changed that much, they're now saying that there's a more than 95% chance that humans have caused at least half of the global warming over the last 50 years. So they've strengthened our understanding of what's causing global warming. They also talk about climate sensitivity, which is how much global temperatures go up if we double atmospheric CO2. And I think in the fourth assessment report, the range of values, the climate sensitivity was between 2 degrees to a maximum of 4.5 degrees, with the most likely value being 3 degrees. So if we double CO2, if it goes up to 560 parts per million, then eventually global temperature would warm 3 degrees from pre-industrial temperatures. Now, with the new assessment report, the most likely value is still 3 degrees. So nothing's changed there. But what they have changed is the range of possible values. So they've now changed it from 2 to 4.5. Now it's 1.5 to 4.5. So they've just lowered the lower estimate of sensitivity, which is like the best case scenario if we're as lucky as possible and the climate reaction isn't as strong as possible. And so there's been a lot of excitement about just the fact that they've lowered the lowest value. Now, not many people have paid much attention to the fact that the best estimate is still the same. We still expect there to be 3 degrees warming if we double CO2. And I guess a lot of people would like to bet the farm on this very unlikely possibility that it could be right back down at 1.5 degrees warming. Even then, that would be quite serious. And I think there's a graph that we produced it actually, but it was originally done by Michael Tobis that showed that if we continue along business as usual, even the best case scenario for low sensitivity is still very serious and has big impacts on society. And so that's I think one of the key messages that should come from this IPCC report is that even if the best case scenarios happen, the consequences are still serious and we still need to act.
Yes, it's going to be a kind of extended period of very considerable press coverage, though, isn't it, Glenn? Because what's being released at the end of the month is the summary for policymakers, which is like the headlines from that Working Group 1 report, and it's the one that's going to get. You can expect, and we can already see signs of this, that all the usual suspects are going to be pointing out the new lower sensitivity estimate for the lower bound. They'll be picking on every possible word they can to misrepresent the seriousness of the issue.
But there's also, in the background to this, there's the conversations beginning to happen about the structure of these reports and about the timing of these reports. There was an article by Suzanne Goldenberg in The Guardian where she's found that there are international scientists calling for an overhaul of the United Nations, what they call blockbuster climate reports, ahead of this Working Group 1 report. Some scientists are saying that we should be doing these major assessments or asking the question whether or not we should be doing these major assessments every 5 years or so, or should we be doing more targeted assessments that policymakers need, but it's just not clear at this stage. But that conversation is happening about whether or not perhaps these reports, when they come out, they're a little bit out of date, John.
Well, I mean, the fifth assessment report is already out of date and it hasn't even come out yet, and based on the leaked report. And their cutoff was the middle of last year, any peer-reviewed paper published after that cutoff couldn't be included in the report. So, and the amount of research that is being produced by climate science at them is accelerating. There's just a flood of new evidence and new research coming out. And by having these reports coming out every 5 years, it's really it's like an old-fashioned way of doing something in a modern world. And yeah, they do need to look at producing. I mean, we need authoritative reports like these. It really is a good way to sum up what the consensus positions are, but they need to be taking advantage of the latest science, and I think coming out more regularly in some way. I don't know how that is practical, given that all the scientists who are producing these reports are volunteering. They're doing it on their own time for zero pay. So yeah,
they kind of go at a glacial pace, but the glaciers are actually melting faster than these reports are coming out in many ways.
Sorry, I was just going to say that the last point that John made, I think, is a really good one, and that is that a lot of really hard-working climate scientists put a huge amount of time and effort into the IPCC process. And it is a huge amount of time over a sort of 2 to 3 year period to produce these things. And you have to ask, is that worthwhile? Would they not perhaps be better producing, as John says, more targeted reports that deal with specific things that keep up with the speed of events, as it were, both in terms of the science as it's being done, but also in terms of events as they happen, because one of the stories we're going to talk about later is about people producing quite rapid reports on extremes, getting some attribution for, is there a climate change element in it? That sort of thing is, I think, where the science is happening quickest, and where we need to get that out into the policy world to get policymakers, if they're not Tony Abbott, to pay attention and plan policies that can deal with them.
All right.
So I'd sort of, I think the IPCC was originally set up to answer the basic question: is climate change going to be a problem? And now we've known for at least 10 years that climate change is not only going to be a problem, but it's happening already. All we've done is add 5% to the certainty between AR5 and AR4. So the questions that policymakers need answered now are much more detailed. But we are so far away from the reality of it. Is it real? That question was answered a very long time ago. We need to be answering, how do we cope with this? What are the smart things that we can do to address emissions? That's where our policymakers really should be.
And another report came out in August that policymakers should be looking at. This was the report done by NOAA, the 2012 State of the Climate Report. What did it find, Gareth?
Well, let's just skip that, and we'll come back to that in a second, because directly relevant to what we were just saying is another NOAA report which came out slightly more recently, which is analyses of 12 extreme weather and climate events during 2012. And they fairly conservatively found that of these 12 extreme weather and climate events, at least half were showing measurable impacts of climate change, making them worse or altering them in some way. So that's it's the second kind of annual report on extremes that's been put together and published in the Bureau of the American Meteorological Society. And it covers a number of, I'm just going to flick through my tabs here and find the actual bits. But so they were looking. Yeah.
Well, like just you were saying that half of the extreme weather was either caused by it or influenced by it in some way. They use a metaphor, and I always love a good metaphor. And the metaphor they used to explain that
is this one sticky, John? Is this one sticky?
this is sticky, and it's the kind of thing you could use a good picture, a cartoon, or an animation with. It's like when you're driving a car and then you just put your foot to the metal and you're speeding. Now, if you have an accident, then it's not necessarily the speeding doesn't necessarily cause the accident. It could be a truck or someone walks out onto the street. But what the speeding does is it either increases the likelihood that you'll have an accident, or if you do have an accident, it makes it worse. And that's what climate change is really doing. It doesn't necessarily cause all these events, but it increases the likelihood of them happening, or it makes them worse.
Exactly right. The event that there is a New Zealand event that gets covered in the report by a group led by Sam Dean from NIWA, and it looks at the flooding in Nelson and Golden Bay that happened last year. I think it was December 2011. In fact, 2-day rainfalls in Golden Bay were much more likely to occur because of the increase in moisture, available moisture, because of the warming in the region, and the particular weather setup that produced that rainfall was not necessarily itself made more likely, but because of the warming in the oceans and the air, more water was able to be brought onto the land and to cause these big inundation events. So that was fascinating from a local thing. And I mean, of course, the angry Australia also experienced extreme rainfalls in between October 2011 and March 2012. And the actual rainfall patterns were caused by the presence of a La Nina, but the likelihood of extreme precipitation increased because of the record sea surface temperatures around Australia at the time.
And also with the Australia's angry summer, a study came out from David Carrolley recently, and it was interesting, the media reported that their main result was that over the last, I think the last decade, the likelihood of having extreme heat waves was at least 5 times more likely than over the previous century. So heat waves are 5 times more likely because of climate change. But when I actually met David Carrolley a month or two ago in Melbourne, and I was really surprised because I hadn't actually read the paper, and what he said was they're actually the best estimate was they were 9 times more likely because of climate change. 5 times was just the lower estimate. And it's one of those sort of frustrating things where scientists, I guess, tend to express their results in the most conservative way. Let's just communicate the lower estimate, because I guess it opens them up to less chance of criticism. Whereas the best estimate was actually 9 times. And it's the same with the IPCC, where they say we think there's a 95% chance that humans have caused at least half of global warming. That's just the lower estimate. The actual best estimate is about 90%. Over the last 50 years, over the last 50 years, humans have caused about 100% of global warming. Yeah. That's the best estimate. But I digress.
But most informatively, as always, John.
So I want to return back to that State of the Climate report.
Follows quite nicely, because this is also from the American organization NOAA, and also published in the Bureau of the American Meteorological Society. And it's a special supplement where meteorologists and climate scientists from around the world put together a kind of state of the climate, quite literally, and they look at what's been happening in that year over the whole planet. And what they found was, so we knew it all already, but of course, but 2012 was one of the 10 warmest years on record. A weak La Nina ended. There was unprecedented Arctic warmth, creating a new sea ice minimum. So if you want an overview of what's been happening in our climate system for the last year, or for the year the last year finished, these annual supplements are actually a superb resource, because they go to the regional experts to write the chapters. They're just jam-packed with graphics, information, good illustrations, and so on. So I'm putting it in here because I think it's something that, a bit like an IPCC report, this is a rapid response, even though it's now 9 months since the end of 2012, but in scientific terms, this is a rapid response to what's actually happening in the climate system.
Could I point out a couple of the little factoids that I found interesting, Glenn?
Yeah, please.
One thing I thought was interesting was that they observed that the stratosphere continues to cool, the upper atmosphere, and that's one of the fingerprints of greenhouse warming, is the upper atmosphere cooling while the lower atmosphere warms. So that, I thought that was interesting. Another thing was that the CO2 hit 400 parts per million in a few Arctic stations. So that's the first time that we'd measured 400 parts per million since we started directly measuring it. And the other thing was that I thought kind of jumped out at me was that 97% of the Greenland ice sheet surface melted in 2012. And I always do like to see that 97% number in climate discussions.
Very good, John. 97% of all scientists would agree with you, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay. So go check out those reports. They will be in the show notes and the links there, and go and read them for yourself. I noticed there was a couple of versions of the NOAA one. There was a sort of a highlights or the full report. So if you're short on time, just check out the highlights version. Let's go to some local New Zealand news now. It's been a long while since actually we've talked about ethical investing on the show. I remember, pretty sure it was a very early climate show. We brought up ethical investing at one point, but the Auckland Anglican Church has decided they're not going to be oil barons anymore, and they're going to walk away from the oil fields, or they're thinking about it at least. Gareth, tell us about this. What brought them around to this decision?
Well, that's very interesting. The Anglican Church have been thinking about their responsibilities, if you like, to the environment for some time now, and they called a special synod or a conference in Auckland last weekend, and they had it. They did it properly. They got, and in fact, I'm going to be blogging about some of the presentations there. Jim Renwick, who's one of New Zealand's most prominent climate scientists and an IPCC lead author and an expert on the southern annular mode, amongst other things. He did a presentation for them, a video presentation. One of our more perspicient, is that the right word? Perceptive, perhaps, business commentators, a guy called Rod Oram, talked to them also about the business realities of fossil fuel disinvestment. And they took a vote and they said they are no longer going to invest in any fossil investments. They don't think they've actually got any in New Zealand, but they do have investments overseas, and they're going to give themselves 2 years to divest from any investment that has any relation to the use of fossil fuels. So I think that's a particularly a good and powerful ethical statement coming from the church. And interestingly, the Catholic Church may well follow suit. The Catholic bishops are going to meet and discuss what the Anglicans have done, and hopefully in a spirit of ecumenical competition, perhaps they'll feel that they perhaps ought to be doing something similar. And I think it's interesting. This is the thing that the 350.org have been campaigning on. Bill McKibben and his Do the Maths is focusing on getting people to move their investments away from fossil fuel extraction and fossil fuel use, and to put it into something else. And I think I may have said this on the show before, but once these sorts of things happen, market sentiment in the financial markets is a fairly fickle thing. And if they can see that their investments are either increasing in risk or decreasing in value because of what some people are doing, and maybe a fashion is starting, then this could have a very significant effect, and you could find that things actually happen quicker than you might expect. A good example would be New Zealand has a fund called the Super Fund, which has a so-called responsible investment policy, which at the moment means not investing in tobacco or cluster munitions and so on. But the World Wildlife Fund did a report that found that it still had well over 7% of its direct equity funding in oil, gas, and coal. Now, it's still a very big chunk of the NZ Super Fund, which is several tens of billions now, I think. Forgive me for not knowing the exact number. So it wouldn't actually harm the NZ Super Fund greatly to move out of its fossil fuel investments. But that little amount could be enough to kind of start a ball rolling.
Yeah, certainly could do, and I guess it gets the conversation going, which I think is really important as well, to actually talk about ethical investing and what that actually means, but also to not be stuck in one definition, I suppose, of what it means, because for some ethical investment portfolios, being involved perhaps with coal or something may be acceptable, whereas munitions or chemical weapons would not. But to be flexible further down the road, to change that definition and go, no, actually, hang on, coal these days it's not as ethical as it used to be. And so that flexibility in the future and that conversation that people have around it will be very, very positive, I think, anyway.
I think it's also a really positive contribution that the church can make to this kind of discussion. And I gave a talk at Emmanuel College, which is a Christian college at the University of Queensland last year, and there was a talk to Christians from a Christian point of view, and what I was saying was that climate change is actually an opportunity for the church to take a leadership role, a moral leadership role, and point to those Christian values of social justice and environmental care. And so I think it's great that the church is taking a role like this.
There goes the bat phone. You need to take that.
Hopefully someone will answer it out there.
Okay, it's funny. I a few years back when I was looking at the values of the Anglican Church, I was in a sort of a discussion with a friend who was inside the Anglican Church. The values, if you turned the church into a political party, it would probably sit in the green, sort of the left-hand side of the spectrum. So it would be good to see that that the work in the community, whether through investments or whatever, also perhaps reflected those credentials. I don't know. Would you agree with that, Gareth? Have you ever looked at it like that? If the Anglican Church was turned into a political party, it would be almost like the Green Party.
Yeah, it depends. I think it depends a great deal on which particular church you're looking at, to be honest, because you could certainly find fundamentalist interpretations of Scripture that were not particularly socially liberal, which is certainly where I think the New Zealand Green Party is, and I think the Australian Green Party, in fact most Green parties around the world, would be fairly socially liberal. But I do think that, and I'm not a churchgoer, but my mother, bless her cotton socks, is, I do think that church-going people feel that they have a moral duty to take these issues seriously, and they will approach them in a thoughtful and considerate way, considered way, that can only help to get the sorts of discussions that we need to have about policy going. I mean, I'm not equipped to quote Scripture, but it's about stewardship, isn't it, John?
Well, there's really two ways you could approach this, and for most Christians, they do look at it as a stewardship thing, that God has given us this planet and we're to care for it. But the other way of looking at it, that really complements the stewardship way, is to look at it from a social justice point of view, and that really is one of the main motivators that drives me in caring about this issue, because that's really one of the key core values of Christianity. And one of the great ironies of climate change is that the people who contribute least to climate change are the ones who are suffering the most from it, and they're also the ones who are least able to adapt to it. The developing countries like Bangladesh that are already getting hit by rising sea levels, And so, yeah, so I think there's either issue, but Glenn, I mean, it's an interesting question you make because like this is not all. Obviously, the examples you give are a good counterexample, but often Christian values and politically conservative values overlap, and there's a big overlap between those two groups, particularly in America, but in Australia as well. The Christians tend to be quite politically conservative, and so while Gareth's idea of a careful, considered approach to the climate issue sounds great in theory, in reality, what often happens is I guess politically conservative Christians tend to react to climate change in a fairly negative way, I guess. Not really open to the science as much.
And we don't want to go too far down the religious rabbit hole, but if you stripped it all back, all religion back, it's all about loving one another and caring for one another and making sure that what you do doesn't adversely affect your neighbour. If you really want to strip it down to that and just general love and making sure no one else is getting hurt, in a world like that, no one would be arguing about whether or not they should be burning more coal or not. They'll be going, no, we shouldn't be, because it's hurting these people on the other side of the world. These people who are poorer than us and who are less able to cope with the effects. So that's if you strip it all the way back. But of course, there's many centuries and layers of politics and interpretation all on top of it. Really. Hey, shall we move on? We've got a good story.
I think you were getting. Yeah, you were just getting a bit, your hippie roots were showing there, Glenn. I thought we were going to. I thought we were going to get John Lennon going. All you need is love. Shortly,
Kumbaya. Let's move on because we've got a good story about some solutions here. Rooftop solar is on the rise. US utilities are striking back. Solar is definitely going forward in the States. Actually, and before we talk about that, did you guys hear about the walkie scorchy building here in London that was burning people on the pavement? Have you heard about
was that the one that was reflecting the sunlight?
That's right. So there's a
wow, yeah.
There's a building that's been built in central London, city of London. That's it's called the walkie-talkie because it's kind of a concave, am I right? Concave like that. And it's larger at the top and smaller at the bottom. Some say it's a greedy building because people can sell the floor space for more, and there's more floor space on top of the building. But anyway, the architect didn't take into account that it's at one point of the year, this time of the year, for around about 2 weeks, the sun strikes because it's a good big glass building. Sun strikes it, and it concentrates it down on the pavement below. There was a car, a very expensive car, something like a Jaguar or something like that, that had some of its panels melting, and the dashboard kind of all bubbling up. The pavement, people have been able to literally, people normally say, oh, it's a hot day, cook some eggs. No, you can cook some eggs on this pavement. Someone's bike was parked there, a push bike. The bike seat started to bubble and melt. They've been measuring temperatures up to 70 degrees in there as well. Wow. Just really, really uncomfortable. And it covers a sort of a 5 to 10 meter sort of radius sort of space. And so they've had to erect some screens and then figure out what they're going to do in the future. But what this actually also did, it got the conversation going around solar in the media, on the BBC and places like that, and saying that, oh, well, this is how those solar farms work in the States out there in the desert, where you've got a central point and all these mirrors around the central point, focusing the sun's energy into that tower in the top and boiling the water and creating the steam for the turbines. It got the conversation going around that, and so people were thinking, well, how can we harness all the solar energy from this building in central London? So I thought that was cool. But check it out online, and there's plenty of stories about that. We perhaps should put something in the show notes if people have missed that story.
So it takes It takes a bubbling bike seat to get people talking about solar power. It reminds me of a little boy with a magnifying glass burning ants.
Yes, that's that's exactly what it's likened to, and I think people are just amazed at how much energy hitting a relative small space, really, the side of this building, how much energy it actually creates and heat and whatnot. So I think it was a good large scale science experiment. But anyway, this rooftop solar is on the rise, Gareth.
Yeah, I wanted to put this into the show because it's an example of how little things might, it's a tipping point in the right direction, if you like. And although what the story is about rooftop solar photovoltaic, so these are the panels that you put on your roof, they pick up the sunlight, turn it into electricity, and if you're lucky, it runs the meter backwards, and so you get a reduced power bill. And in most parts of the states, certainly most of the southern and western states, this is a very, already economic for houses to do, and there have been a mixture of incentives and so on. But it's still a tiny part of the overall industry. It only supplies less than 1% of the electricity in the US. Now, obviously, the potential is very much larger, but photovoltaic panel prices have been dropping. Federal organization, federal and state incentives have been pretty generous, and there's low-cost financing for installation. And this has begun to get the major the power-generating utilities, at least some of them in the US, a little bit worried because it's approaching the point where it's cheaper for somebody to install the solar panels on their roof than it is to buy the electricity from the utility. Now, the utilities generally are supposed to produce the cheapest electricity, and in the States they get an awful lot of that from coal, but they are beginning to move on to that sort of giant scale solar stuff and wind installations and so on. But the critical thing with the photovoltaics on the roof is that it kind of changes the whole dynamic, because suddenly if you've got somebody else making the investment into putting these things on the roofs, that suddenly they are only using you as a backup. You're not going to make much money by growing your electricity generation or sales if your customers are out there doing their damnedest to reduce what they take from you. So some of the big power utilities in the US have gone with the flow, as it were, and are looking at ways to capitalize on this sort of sea change in the economics of power generation. Others, as you might expect in the US, are doing their damnedest to try and get rid of the incentives for photovoltaics. They're really doing their best to, I think, one company has accused the Arizona Public Service, the state's biggest utility, of wanting to extinguish the independent rooftop solar market to protect its monopoly. So I think it's really interesting that if the big utilities are willing to spend money and effort to campaign against rooftop solar, then that's got to be a really good sign that rooftop solar photovoltaics are really beginning to get them worried, and that therefore the economics are tipping away from those big power utilities. Now, I could bring this back to the New Zealand experience, and that is that through most of New Zealand, rooftop solar will produce a good return on a reasonable investment, because panel prices have been falling. I think that there are only two power companies offer you the kind of the full retail discount for the power that you generate. But even so, it's a payback of about 10 years, and I think the return ends up as being better than leaving the money in the bank. So unfortunately, you won't find anybody in New Zealand outside of a few enthusiasts really pushing the rooftop revolution, because the government is particularly keen to flog the generation companies. In their so-called mixed ownership model, they want to sell 49% of our big hydropower generator to the stock market and to so-called mother and father investors who live in Arizona, probably. And it really, if this is happening in the US now, it could be happening here too, could be happening in Australia. That changes the dynamics and the economics of power generation in a big way, and it could happen. As you see, it's already happening in the US to a certain extent. It could happen here in New Zealand. It could happen in Australia. Unless you give the big utilities an incentive to buy the power from people, then for them, they're not selling as much electricity to those people. So one way that they've done it in some states is by saying that, any generation utility has to have a certain amount, a so-called renewable obligation. They have to buy so much of their energy or source so much of their energy from wind or solar or whatever. And that's certainly the case. I think it was certainly the case in the UK for a while, although I think the details have changed there. But that's one way that you can do it. You can say to the utilities, you've got to have this particular mix of generation. You've got to encourage renewables. You can do it by it's one of the difficulties with encouraging the efficiency argument. How do you get somebody who makes a living by selling you lots of electricity to work with you to reduce the amount of electricity you buy? And so you've got to be quite creative in the way that you do it. And it comes down to renewable obligations, it comes down to rules, regulations, and fiddling with the market, if you see what I mean.
Okay, well, it certainly is an interesting space, and hopefully we'll see some more pickup on that in New Zealand on the other side of these asset sales, maybe, Gareth. That's almost our last story. And there's something you wanted to highlight, climateprediction.net.
Yes, absolutely. Now that is fascinating. It started 10 years ago. It's one of these distributed computing projects where you can basically donate the free processor cycles in your desktop or laptop computer to a scientific project. And there have been a number of these over the years. I believe they've done molecular modeling, 3D modeling of molecules is one that I'm sure there have been others too. But this particular climateprediction.net allows you to effectively run a small climate model in your computer in the computer's downtime or spare time, and then that gets uploaded back to the central servers and they get aggregated. And this has been run out of Oxford University in the UK for 10 years now, and they've done a huge amount of work. If you go to the climateprediction.net website, you can see a huge list of, well, I'd say huge, it's about 10, I think 8 or 10 or so big projects that they've worked on. And the reason I put it there is partly because wish them all a happy birthday, because it happens this week. Congratulations on 10 years. Yeah. It's something I would really like to do, is to run this software in the background. And just to say that sometime very soon, I expect the announcement in the next month or two, there's going to be a climateprediction.net for Australia and New Zealand. Okay. And the scientists who are working with climate models and climate modeling in the region will be able to use the distributed computing resource, could be from anywhere around the world, to run the climate modeling, to do one of the classical uses is to run lots of different instances of the same model, so you can look at how the statistics of a particular given detailed event change as the climate changes. Have you got any comments on climateprediction.net, John?
I have to confess I haven't installed it on my own laptop, which runs slow enough as it is. So, yeah. But maybe when this Australian version comes out, I'll really have to be a good example and install it.
Well, I certainly plan to.
So does that, with an Australian or New Zealand version, does that mean the projects are localized, but the software is kind of the same?
Yeah, basically they run a kind of a regional climate model, so that we can look in detail at the changes or the modeling of the climate of the region. The boundary is probably set by a global model, but then the regional model kind of takes the boundary settings from the big global model and sees what's happening down at a much more detailed level.
Okay, well, I tell you what, I'm very keen to give this a go. I've got a little tower here that's often not doing much during the day while I'm out at work. I might get the software going, and I know that it will obviously be doing something, but I do hope that it provides some kind of feedback or says, hey, I've done this today, or sort of gives a little report or a progress bar of what's actually going on.
Oh no, it gives it the full graphics. Actually, you can watch the weather in your model as it changes and moves. So it's quite impressive.
Brilliant. I can create my own little weather system. That sounds really, really good. Climateprediction.net. If you missed that link, you'll find it in the show notes, which will be up at hot-topic.co.nz. Also theclimateshow.com, which currently redirects to hot-topic.co.nz till we get that web page up and running again. Any final thoughts, guys?
The last time we had a show, I was predicting that Australia would win the Ashes. So yes.
I won't mention the rugby either then.
No, as I've said before, it's a rubbish sport. I don't follow it, and I'm starting to feel the same way about cricket as well.
Well, I have to say that I've become a little bit more interested in the wind in San Francisco in the last few days, with the America's Cup taking place and Team New Zealand 3-1 up already in actual races. They're a bit further ahead in terms of points, but those yachts are just staggering to watch.
Do they have wind keels still these days?
Yeah, they foil. So these giant catamarans are doing 50 kilometers per hour on foils out of the water. Go and watch, John. It's just staggering. Anyway, that's nothing to do with climate. It is to do with weather, I suppose. But by the time we meet again, I imagine, Glenn, it'll be a few weeks. So I think the big topic for us to look forward to is the final version of the summary for policymakers, which will give us plenty to talk about next time.
Looking forward to that. So in the meantime, hot-topic.co.nz, theclimateshow.com. Follow us on Facebook as well, facebook.com/theclimateshow. Also on Twitter, twitter.com/theclimateshow. That's where we can continue the discussion there as well. Thanks very much for anyone who's posted a message over on the Facebook page. Really good to have your engagement there and talking about what we do and talking about the issues with climate science, policy and politics and solutions out there as well. My name is Glenn Williams, also been with Gareth.
Hello everybody and good night.
And John.
See you later. See you later.
And we'll see you next time here on The Climate Show.